All right, hello again and welcome. This is Gerry Gebel. Thank you again for joining us today for this Axiomatics webinar on securing APIs and microservices using ABAC, OAuth, and OpenID Connect. So we have a few of the usual rules for webinars. You are muted centrally, so we'll get a good recording for this session today. And that recording will be made available to you shortly after the event. So if you can't join us live, you can listen later or share the link with friends and colleagues. And then, of course, we will have a Q&A session at the end of our presentation and demonstration today. So you can enter those questions at any time in the GoToWebinar Q&A box. So let's get started. Today we're talking about APIs, microservices, and how to secure them. I'm joined by my esteemed colleague, David Brossard. David, welcome to the webinar.
Thanks, Gerry. Good morning, good afternoon.
Absolutely, and of course, you know, we're doing the presentation today, but this work is really the culmination of effort of a number of our colleagues over the past several months. So we can't take full credit for that work. So definitely a shout out to Jonas, Mons, and the rest of the team for their input on this. And it turns out, David, this has been quite a popular topic. It seems like almost every conversation we have with customers and partners is centered around APIs and how you secure them. So we're pretty excited to bring this content to you today.
Oh, absolutely. There's more and more companies, as you all mentioned in the presentation, that go to an API first strategy and need to apply the right controls, the right levels of security to make sure that nothing bad happens.
That's always the trick, right? The balancing act there.
Right.
So before we dive right into the protocols and the technology, we'll introduce some backdrop here and business context. You know, a short discussion there before we jump in. And I think what we're seeing in many cases, David, is this urgency to modernize. And we've noticed this meme on the next slide that, you know, every company is a software company or wants to be a software company or thinks they are. And we see so many disruptors in many different industries, either forcing legacy organizations to take this approach, or just the demands of the business world today that are driving them in this direction. And of course, this kind of modernization on the next slide is often focused around an API first model, as you were just saying. You know, whether they're building new applications, new customer portals, or refactoring existing applications, it seems like the discussion for developers is all around, okay, how do I build this in an API first approach? How do I utilize the microservice architecture model and be able to rapidly deploy new services or immediately change, immediately adapt to changing conditions in their particular industries. And furthermore, David, you know, the backdrop here also includes this notion of digital transformation. I know it's a frequently used term in our industry today, but it's definitely appropriate to this particular topic, because we see on the left side of the next slide here, if you've advanced it already, on the left side, it's really the business side of the transformation process, where we're dealing with different kinds of communities and constituencies. And, and then on the right side, it's more of an IT perspective.
Right, where, I mean, if you want to put this in context, Gerry, to take an example, the auto industry is shifting from manufacturing cars and selling cars to actually selling services around those cars. So they're no longer a car manufacturer industry, but rather a transportation services industry, which means that they want to be able to connect to the vehicles they're selling to the individuals, grab the data, grab all the intelligence from the sensors in those vehicles, and be able to potentially analyze them or resell them to different parties. And in turn, it changes the IT landscape, because instead of dealing with a few employees, a few applications, a few services, you're dealing with a lot more data than before, a lot more sensors, a lot more consumers of that data. And it also means that you want to be, in the way you build your IT services, you want to be agile and you want to be able to build up very quickly. So technology like containerization is going to help you build up your infrastructure faster than you could before. Technology like machine learning, big data, artificial intelligence are all things they're going to be able to use to analyze the trove of information that you're dealing with.
Absolutely. It's not just about APIs and microservices, although that's our focus for today, but it's this interrelation between those other technologies. And so, David, I'm not seeing the slide advance. I don't know if that's just on my side or, oh, there they go. Okay. Good to go.
Can you see them now?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Thanks. Maybe just a slight technical glitch on my side. So then on the next slide, of course, it's interesting to note that OWASP is also calling out this as an issue here. When they updated their top 10 list last year, you can see that the last one is under protected APIs, and that this is now an area of concern.
Right. So the more you open up with your APIs, the greater the risk you're going to be sharing information with individuals without necessarily realizing it, without there being an attack necessarily either. There was a great example of last year how companies stored information inside of Amazon S3 buckets, and they didn't realize that the way they stored the information, the way they configured the environment, they were actually making those buckets public, and people could try to guess where the buckets were and get access to the information. So that was misconfiguration, or as OWASP calls it, underprotected APIs. And we're going to see more of those cases, I think.
Unfortunately, hopefully we can address this particular topic so it doesn't stay on their top 10 for too long. It's unfortunately many of these issues do stay on their top 10 list for a long time, like cross-site scripting, for example. So then when we jump into the authorization topic here related to API security and so on, we're talking about dynamic authorization. Axiomatics specializes in this area, and this is we're all about either granting or denying access to data, to resources, to content, and in this case, into APIs and microservices in particular. But as we'll mention later as we wrap up the session, of course, this model applies to other kinds of resources like databases, and big data systems. So, so David, yes, sir.
Sorry, as you know, Gerry, I like to call that the any depth, and we'll see that in a few slides, or the any breadth authorization. The whole idea that when you want to tackle fine-grained dynamic authorization, you don't just want to do it for the one app or the one service, rather you want to do it for a wide range of applications and services at any location, any depth, and in a consistent and coherent way.
Absolutely, and we do that, David, of course, with the ABAC model, attribute-based access control.
Right. So ABAC is a model that it's not a new model. It's been around for quite some time. It was popularized by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, a few years ago, I think 2013, if memory serves well. And ABAC is all about saying, well, look, we're going to define authorization based on policy, and we're going to define authorization based on attributes. And when I say attributes, we're going to be looking at more than just the identity dimension. Authorization historically, and Gerry, you'll touch on that later, tends to focus on the user only, their identity, their role, their group, or their scope, or their claims. But in fact, in ABAC, you want to go beyond that, and you want to consider things like who the user is, of course, so the identity dimension, but what it is they want to do, and what do they want to do it on? Are we dealing with financial transactions or medical records or other types of information? And going beyond the who and the what, it's also when they're doing it. What time is it? Is it 3 in the morning? Is it 3 in the afternoon? Where are they doing it from? Are they in a rogue country, or are they in a trusted location? Why are they doing it? What's the purpose of use? And also how they're doing it. Are they using a personal device, a corporate device? Are they using a VPN, an unsecured network? So all these are attributes that you can use in your decision making to make authorization more context aware, more dynamic, and a better decision at the end of the day, because we will be able to decide based on those multiple factors or those multiple dimensions.
Right, and usually we only talk about ABAC, but also, of course, today we're also including OAuth 2.0 and OpenID Connect, or as it's commonly known, OIDC, into the conversation here.
Right.
And these standards and profiles have evolved more recently than say the ABAC model. ABAC in our case based on the XACML or XACML standard, which has been around longer than OAuth and OpenID Connect. But we're here today to talk about how these can complement each other. And where OAuth 2.0 or even 1.0 was originally built for the delegated consent or delegated authorization scenario, right? The password anti-pattern, so you did not have to share your actual credential with third-party apps to allow access to certain functions or data.
Right.
Then, of course, OpenID Connect came along a little bit later and added a lot of functionality, essentially added an identity layer to OAuth 2.0 to more easily facilitate single sign-on across domains and so on. Introduced different kinds of token formats like the JWT or JSON Web Token. So a lot of great functionality here in these two standards, although we of course don't do a deep dive into these technologies today.
I think what's important to stress is that OAuth 2 is what I would like to call authorization delegation, right? Granting someone the ability to do something on a resource that you own, right? That the original user owns. And OpenID Connect is very much the next-gen federation or authentication for web-based resources. Yeah, so it's have a look at the ABAC authorization flow and see how that relates to OpenID and OAuth 2.0, right?
Absolutely. So in this case, the typical ABAC flow here, is where you have some user attempting to access some function, data, API, transaction. And there's a policy enforcement point or PEP in that flow, and this component can take lots of different form factors. In today's discussion, we centered that mostly around API gateways, but it can take other forms. And so that intercepts the flow and it constructs a standard authorization request message to send back to the decision service or the authorization service. And this is where you manage your policies and rules for who can access what. This is where you are able to connect to lots of different attribute sources to retrieve those attributes you were talking about earlier, David. And then once we evaluate all that, then we can return back to the enforcement point whether this action should be permitted or allowed, and then the process and the flow carries on from there.
Right, so it's actually a very simple principle where what we've done essentially is decouple the enforcement from the decision making from the management. And that's, you can see that quite clearly that at the very top of your screen you have your enforcement point that will do the enforcement, of course, hence the name, and that sits between the user or the client and the application. And that enforcement point can take multiple form factors. It could be an API gateway, it could be a filter, it could be a SQL proxy, it could be many different things. And then that's decoupled from the decision engine, which could sit anywhere. And I think, Gerry, later you'll talk about how it could be a microservice. And that in turn is decoupled from the management of the policies, which are centralized. So number one, you get policies to define authorization. And number two, you get better visibility over what the policies express and better manageability because you manage them from a central point.
Exactly. And so, David, a common security pattern that we do see today is often where OAuth 2.0 and or OpenID Connect are used to secure APIs and microservices. And we think certainly that's appropriate for lots of different use cases, but of course there are some limitations as well, right?
Yeah, it is. I like to see OAuth and OpenID Connect maybe in limited view where they're all about the plumbing and the connection. It's all about connecting one API to another API, potentially on behalf of another user. It's all about authorization delegation. It's all about authentication as well, right? One of the aspects of OAuth is to solve, like you said, the password anti-pattern. Not so long ago, whenever we wanted to connect our bank account to our expenses account, we would have to type in the username password for the bank account into the third-party system. Well, we don't do that anymore, of course. OAuth came along to solve that issue. But I think one of the reasons why OAuth and OpenID are so prevalent in an API and a microservices environment is because a lot of APIs, microservices, just expose very simple functionality where there's not necessarily a very thick backend where we would need more advanced authorization. And this is where we see that when we do have microservices that expose very sensitive information, medical data, export control regulated information, IP information, there and then you need a policy, there and then you need finer grained authorization to determine what information can be consumed and returned from the microservice to whoever's requesting that information. And that's where ABAC fits in quite naturally. So it's beyond that first door. It's looking at additional parameters and looking at the data that is being consumed and determining whether the requester can get access to that information.
Right. So we're not suggesting that ABAC replaces OAuth or OpenID Connect, but rather complements them when you need this extra functionality.
Of course, they work hand in hand. They do not really address the same dimensions, and OAuth, OpenID are really about the connection of those APIs and the front door. ABAC and policy-driven authorization are very much about the authorization beyond that front door. So
go ahead, David. Here we start to talk about how more specifically how they work together.
Right. So one of the limitations of OAuth and OpenID is the lack of a policy language. And I say it's a limitation. I would say it's more about defining the use case for OAuth. It was never really defined to be an enterprise authorization solution, but rather it was to authorize an API to access another API. So there's a bit of overload on the word authorization there. What we want to do with ABAC is say, well, look, we provide the policy language that will help administrators and business analysts and application owners define what data, what services, what transactions can be consumed by whom and under which circumstances. Right now, if you look at OAuth, the way it's being solved is through the generation of multiple scopes. That in a way leads to what is called scope explosion. And if you have scope explosion, of course, you have token bloat because you'll be inserting more and more scopes in your tokens. Like you say on the slide, Gerry, that's kind of a next generation version of role explosion, right? Where we had role explosion in the past. We talk to companies where they have, say, 10,000 employees and 100,000 roles. Well, that's a clear example of role explosion, and scope does not escape that. But another dimension that you highlighted, Gerry, a couple of weeks ago was the API bloat, and I thought that was very interesting. As we move to leaner and more focused microservices, we should also decouple the code that you use in your microservice, in your API to handle authorization. You shouldn't have to write authorization anymore as code. Rather, you should do authorization as configuration, as policy. So you want to externalize that authorization code into a policy and into a central management point. Now, that's going to make your microservice even more more efficient, more focused, and it's going to cleanly, separate the concerns between authorization and business. Now, to do that, of course, if we're dealing with APIs, if we're dealing with microservices, one of the natural integration points will be API gateways. API gateways, CASBs, microservices gateways, what used to be called in the past XML gateways, of course. All these are going to be natural integration points because they sit at the place where there is a clear contract between the consuming entity, the client, and that API, which means in turn, we can make sense of that information and derive meaningful authorizations. Now, one last point, Gerry, to that is that with ABAC, you can do fine-grained authorization on the way in. So for instance, if you're trying to get access to a financial transaction 123, you could ask, oh, can Bob view transaction 123? And you could say, oh, yes, they can, no, they can't. That's what I would call transactional authorization. But you can also do authorization on the way out, on the way back. So if you get a payload that represents a transaction where you might have the amount, the date, the description, and maybe let's say the credit card number associated with the transaction, on the way back, you could have a second round of authorization where you would ask, can I return the field name, field amount, field description, field credit card number to the end user? And the answer would be yes, 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 no, mask or redact the credit card number. So you can do filtering or data tokenization or masking on the way back in the API gateway by looking at the payload and deciding whether to return that information.
I think one just further point here, David, is just that we're trying to avoid some of the bad practices of the past, because it sounds very familiar when you talk about, embedding security logic in applications. Today we're talking about APIs, but of course in the past that was, almost any legacy app that would take that approach.
Yeah, indeed. It's tempting to think that when we design an application or an API or a microservice, that we can foresee the needs of the future. But the truth is, we don't always guess what the application should do. So take a good example, again, a banking example where you want to browse transactions or you want to browse bank accounts. In a traditional model way back when, you'd be able to see your own bank account and that would be it. But today, maybe you want to see your children's bank accounts just to be able to manage them, or maybe you want to see your parents' bank accounts because they're too senior to be able to take care of their own bank accounts. So now you have new authorization use cases that you hadn't thought of in your application, so you have to rewrite your application. Compare that with an API that focuses on just returning account info and you having the ability to define a policy on top of that API that will control who can view what information. It means that developing your app becomes easier. You spend less time developing the app, and it's more future-proof because you have the ability to redefine those scenarios.
Right, so on this slide here, we talk a little bit more about the scope topic, and using just OAuth 2.0, for different scenarios or different sets of permissions, this is where the number of scopes you need to define can get out of hand to cater to some of those different use cases or scenarios that you were just describing.
Right.
And it was really designed for this discretionary or delegated access control model. And then from a programming perspective, then you're just doing similar things to what we did in the past, checking for roles, right, in your next couple of slides here.
Right, so scopes in a way are just a replication of the model we used to have in the past, like you said, where we would assign users roles, and then based on the scopes, based on the roles within the code of the microservice, within the code of the application, we would check whether a user had a given role, had a given scope, and then determine what they can do. When you do that, you end up writing code, and you want to avoid that. So you want to avoid what we like to call programmatic ABAC, programmatic role-based access control, where for a lack of expressiveness or expression within RBAC, we rely on code within the application. So that's exactly what we want to move away from.
Right.
So an example.
Yep, a couple of examples here. First with roles and then with scopes.
Yeah.
Slide. Yep.
So an example here where we're doing a get on an API here to be able to get record 1, 2, 3, and then of course what would have happened here is within the app there's code to verify that the user, if they have the role admin, then they can do the method get on the record /1, 2, 3, so administrators can view that. But it relies on the fact that the roles were passed in up front because we authenticated, we fetched the information from the underlying identity source, typically an LDAP, and therefore authorization was granted not through LDAP, not through the identity provider, but rather through code that verifies the user has the right role. So that's where we end up having spaghetti authorization code peppered across the entire application. And if I keep continuing with the food analogies, I'm going to be hungry. I guess it's almost lunchtime for you, Gerry, right?
Getting close, yes.
Yeah. So, and scopes is pretty much the same thing, right? It's the same picture, except that instead of dealing with roles, we deal with scopes, but it hasn't really changed the paradigm. It hasn't really solved any of the challenges. If anything, it's almost even a little bit more complicated because now we need to know which scopes exist so we can grant them or return them in the tokens that the user will use in the OAuth 2 flows. So
right, so just to re-emphasize, David,
yep.
We're trying to avoid some of the bad practices of the past, or maybe let's say the not the most efficient practices of the past. And you've gone through the concern about scope explosion here in the last couple of slides, and then also the notion of API bloat actually has a couple of dimensions here. One is that you've got now the hard-coded access policies within the API or the microservice itself, and so that's slowing down your developers. They're they're not focusing just on business functionality. You also oftentimes now have limited visibility over the policies and the rules that are in place, right? Because how do you audit that? How do you certify the access when all of this logic is hard coded within the app microservice itself? And then the other dimension of the bloat here is that you may end up trying to circumvent this issue by building separate APIs to handle different user communities. You know, I'll have one API for customers, another for partners, employees, or staff, and so on, as a way to, you know, delineate who can see what data or what functionality. So that's, we think, is an awkward way to go.
Right, absolutely.
So David, how do we put all of these together here?
That's a good question. I think that's why we're here today, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So the first picture here on this slide is OAuth 2.0, OIDC, OpenID Connect without ABAC, where you have a client and they're trying to get access to a resource on the resource server on behalf of a user, and they're going to go to the authorization server so that they can get a token issued, and then based on a grant issued, and based on that they'll get a token which they'll pass to the resource server, which will validate that token with the authorization server, which means they'll be able to get access to the backend data, in this case a record 123. So that's the traditional OAuth OIDC flow. If there is any fine-grained authorization happening there, then it's baked into the business service or potentially baked into the API gateway, but it's either way, it's not externalized. It's really inside of the application. And we have poor visibility of whatever authorization might be taking place. So the PII you want to protect that's in your record might be actually not protected at all. If we look, Gerry, at a ABAC approach, the typical ABAC diagram is the one here. So here we use an API gateway as a natural enforcement point. This is really the generic ABAC flow, and it doesn't really focus on authentication or how authorization delegation has happened. That's happened beforehand. We assume that it's been established before. We assume we know who you are. And now what's going to happen is that the client here, the end user, is going to call the backend an API of sorts, and the API gateway in the middle in green here will intercept that API call, will analyze the API request and convert it into an authorization request, which you can see in step 2. Can the client call API X method Y, send that off to the authorization service, here the Axiomatics policy server. The policy server is configured with a set of policies, authorization policies that make use of multiple attributes. It can call out to external sources of attributes like an LDAP, a database, a NoSQL, a REST endpoint, so on and so forth, in order to reach a decision, either a yes permitted or no denied. And that decision is returned to the API gateway, which enforces that decision. And if it is allowed, forwards the API call to the backend system. If it's not allowed, would return an HTTP 403 or another error that you might want to return to the clients. Now in this picture, we do authorization on the way in, but remember what we said earlier, you can also do authorization on the way back. So you're able with API gateways to inspect responses and potentially redact them based on policies defined in the policy server.
Right, and David, I mean, historically, we would say regarding the authentication step that you could authenticate in any manner you chose.
Absolutely.
Not specifically calling out the the OAuth or OpenID Connect flows. So that's what we're here to do today.
Right, which in turn means that the ABAC approach can support any of the flows that we see and any of the 4 flows we see in OAuth, and can also support legacy models where you might have an API, an enterprise API, and it's exposed for a given client ID and a given client secret not using OAuth, and that model can also be supported. In those cases, though, you have to keep in mind, you have to know what identity you want to use as the end identity for the authorization decision, right? It's not necessarily the client identity that matters, but rather the end user's identity that matters. And all that can be configured in your API gateway, of course.
And then over here on the right, of course, you list a number of logos of different API gateways that we already have integrations with. So that's we don't dive into that too much here today, but it's rather easy and straightforward process to configure a gateway in this fashion.
Correct. Because API gateways typically have a language of sorts to configure the gateways, you can use that language to call out to Axiomatics and send all the attributes you want to use in your decision-making process. And then, of course, when the response comes back, it's easy for those gateways to understand whether the response is a yes or a no, and then change the flow based on that response. In the demo today, we'll see that I use Apogee as an example of an API gateway.
Right, and some of the things the gateway can do, one of the reasons we're focusing on them in our presentation here is because they're really the mediator in the middle that handles the different flows, right? So they can deal with the OAuth or OIDC servers to validate tokens, to retrieve tokens, call out to the user info endpoint, for example. Or to validate a token that's been presented by a client app. They can parse a token that's in the flow, or just hand that token off to the Axiomatics server for parsing during the authorization request. So there's lots of different functionality that they provide here. In addition, what the value add for an ABAC approach is, now that we're in the flow of access, we can incorporate additional context that's not visible maybe to the client app or to the the OIDC services. And we're likely able to connect to a number of different attribute sources. We can, for example, check whether this access is valid right now. A token may have been issued 5 minutes ago or 5 hours ago, but is it still valid in this particular scenario? And then another capability that you often point out is, now within the ABAC system, we can check more clearly about relationships. Is this record 123 owned by this particular user, or are they somehow related? Is it a family relationship, or in an enterprise scenario, are they in the same department, group, or branch, or so on? So that's some of the additional power that allows ABAC to complement this OpenID Connect and OAuth flows.
Right, absolutely. It enriches the authorization flows and goes beyond just that front door, like I was saying at the beginning. And you're right, Gerry, I really like to stress the fact that with ABAC, you can do relationships. So if you're ever wondering whether you are content with OAuth, OIDC, role-based type authorization, or whether you need attribute-based access control, ask yourself the following questions. Is there a relationship? Is there a relationship between the user and the data? If there is, you're going to need ABAC. You're going to need attribute-based access control. Do you need to do runtime authorization right there and then when you need authorization based on contextual information like time or location? If you do, you're going to need ABAC as well. Any other way wouldn't quite cut it. It wouldn't quite be as dynamic as what ABAC can bring you.
Mm-hmm. And I think another topic to point out here, David, is that this is all utilizing industry standards.
Yes.
So what we've been talking about here and describing is not using custom coding. That's exactly one of the things we're trying to avoid. But rather, we are leveraging the great standards that have been developed over time and can be implemented in this fashion.
Correct. It's and that's a benefit as well. You don't want to be locked into any particular vendor implementation. Rather, you want to build on standards like OAuth, OIDC, XACML, Alpha, to be able to move or manage your policies and know that they will be interoperable and configurable and understandable today and tomorrow.
Right, and I think on the next slide, we described in a little more detail what I think is a really interesting use case. As you said earlier, if I'm doing a get record and that record payload on the way back potentially has sensitive information, could be PII, personally identifiable, or otherwise regulated in some way. Well, now we have a means to call out again to the authorization server and say, okay, based on this user, Alice or Bob or whomever, and this particular record, are there any fields that should be redacted or masked on the way back so that we're not inadvertently or accidentally exposing data that we should not be for this particular use case.
Correct. And the redaction can happen very easily. You can have a policy that dictates which fields are allowed in the response, number one. You could also define JSON path in the policy that would be returned to the API gateway so that the API gateway can use that JSON path to redact the parts of the message. So I say JSON path, the assumption here, of course, is that it would be a JSON message. It could be any different format, XML, JSON being the two most prevalent ones, of course. But that's the way it would work. And then in this picture, what's missing is, of course, the authorization on the way in. The fact that we did go to the back end, the assumption is that, of course, we had access to that record to begin with.
Of course. And then on this next slide here, before we get into your demonstration, we hinted at this a little bit earlier, David, but I think it's also very valuable to consider the authorization service itself as a microservice, in particular, right, the runtime decision engine, because we have seen, our customers deploying it in this fashion, and it adheres to these characteristics of a microservice being stateless. The PDP service in particular is a stateless engine with well-defined interfaces through the XHTML standard. Of course, REST and JSON enabled these interfaces. Bounded context, it only does one function, can be deployed in a fault-tolerant manner quite easily, and of course, container-friendly, in particular Docker-friendly, to deploy the runtime service. So what this also gives you is an ability in a DevOps fashion to manage your authorization service the same way you're managing your application infrastructure, and I think that also is tremendously valuable.
Oh, of course. It means that to spin up and spin down authorization services is a matter of microseconds. I want to, it takes very little time now to actually scale up, scale down your authorization infrastructure, or just spin a new one up. And the only configuration it needs is its policies, and then you're good to go. So there is no state in the authorization services other than the policies themselves.
Right, right. And so that means they're also well suited for automation and orchestration that we see becoming so popular. And I'm sure that'll be a topic for a future webinar.
Right, right. And then for anyone interested, we do already have Dockerized versions of the Axiomatics solutions that you're welcome to try out in your own environments.
Excellent. I think it's demonstration time, David.
It is demonstration time. So I'm going to start off by just showing a little policy that I put together. In the demonstration, what we did was expose an API endpoint. We're using Apogee in this example, so the API gateway becomes Apogee, and in the backend I have a mock transactions API that's actually hosted on GitHub for me, and the Axiomatics policy server is running in Amazon right now. It's exposing a policy which I'm going to show to you. And when we call the API through Apogee, Apogee will call out to Axiomatics to get an authorization decision. The authorization decision is returned back to Apogee, and then Apogee will, for convenience sake, will print out that decision and the response back to us instead of printing out the response from the API. So we're going to see that in a quick demo. Some of the data that we use in the demo, we have two users, Alice and Bob. Alice is an administrator. That's the key thing to remember. She's an administrator, and Bob is a manager in the state of New York or the city of New York. And then we have transaction data. We have 3 transactions in our system, IDs 1, 2, 3. And then what's important to remember is that transaction number 1 and number 2 are approved. Transaction number 3 is not approved. Transaction number 2 is in New York. Okay, so with that in mind, let's have a look at the policies we've written. We have 3 policies. The first one states that administrators can view all their transactions. So Gerry, at first glance, if Alice tried to view transaction 1, do you think she could do that?
Looks like she should be able to.
Yeah, and it looks like she should be able to view transactions 2 and 3 as well. Now, the second policy we're going to tack on to the first one is that users can view transactions in their own region. So
I didn't know there was going to be David, I didn't know there was going to be a test here.
Oh, there's always a test. So users can view transactions in their own region, which means that Bob can only view transaction number 2, right? Because they're in the same location, the same region. And then there's a third policy for fun, a negative policy that restricts access. And that third policy states that no one can view non-approved transactions. So which means that we need to revisit the example we had before. Alice could view transactions 1 and 2. She can no longer view, I'm sorry, Alice could view transactions 1, 2, and 3. I'm failing my own test. She can no longer view transaction number 3. So let's see that in action. Before I actually show you the actual API working, I just want to show you what a policy looks like. This is a very simple example where I have a policy. This is using the abbreviated language for authorization notation. It's a very lightweight notation. It's really aimed at developers and keyboard savvy individuals. And you can see here that I'm controlling access to specific API endpoints, so /axiomatics /transactions. And then I have a policy about viewing transaction. I could very easily here develop another policy about editing transactions. If I knew how to type, it would help. So here I could simply say edit transaction, and then here I could quickly insert an action attribute, and I could say is equal to post, for instance. And then below we could continue writing how the access would be allowed for a post. Now, if we look at the view transaction policy, you can see that we're denying access to the approved transactions, like I said on the slide. We're allowing administrators to do anything on the transaction so long as it's a get, and we're allowing users to view the transactions in their own region. So with that in mind, let's we'll go back to this slide in after the demo. Or did I lose my slide? Oh, there we go. Never mind. I lost my slide. We're going to try the first link here. What that link is it goes, you can see that it goes to my Apigee backend, which exposes my Axiomatics transactions API. And then to make things simpler, I passed in the transaction ID as a URL parameter, and I passed in my user identity as a URL parameter. Now, of course, in real life, you wouldn't pass Alice as a URL parameter because, well, that's not secure. You'd pass it as a OAuth token potentially, or I should say an OpenID Connect token, a dot token, or potentially you would pass it in using another authentication mechanism. Now, can Alice view transaction 1? Well, yeah, you can see the response coming back. Here's a JSON message, access granted a transaction. And of course, in real life, you'd see the actual transaction data coming back to you. Now, if we try transaction 3, Gerry, what do you think will happen?
Well, it should be denied, of course.
Let's give that a go. There you go. You don't have access to the transaction. You're getting an HTTP 403 back. You're getting a JSON message back, so access was denied. And the same for Bob, of course. So Bob cannot view transaction 3. Bob cannot view transaction 1. And if we try transaction 2, you get access granted. Simple as that. So that was a very, very fast demo, Gerry, of the capability. So to wrap it up, we can go ahead and move on to this slide now, where what we show here is the series of solutions that we have within the Axiomatics portfolio, where we have the Axiomatics policy server, which is what I used in the demo, that focuses on the 4 top tiers here in my layered architecture. Integration with web single sign-on, with your presentation tier if you want to do functional access control, with APIs and microservices, with business applications, off-the-shelf applications, so on and so forth. And then beyond that, if you wanted to do authorization at scale and authorization on large or unknown data sets, you would use the data access filter for relational databases, and then you would use SmartGuard for big data for Hadoop-based systems. I'm sorry, Hadoop-based systems. And Gerry, if you want to talk to the key features.
Yeah, I think you did talk about them, but it's about having this consistent and centrally managed policy-based approach across the entire range of the application stack. And we've obviously focused on the APIs today, as you said, but this gives you a view of how you can use the same model for authorization and access control across a range of resource types and improve your governance over those access policies. And another benefit, if you click again, is that this is again across this unified access control model. And then we've got a summary slide here of some points, David, before we run into the Q&A session. We've got a number of good questions teed up already, so please do write them in the GoToWebinar Q&A box. But just to summarize, some of the high points that we've hit today, when we're just trying to give you a teaser of some of this capability here, and in particular describing how OAuth 2.0, OpenID Connect, and ABAC can really work together complementary to address a broader set of authorization requirements than you can do using any of them alone. And so, of course, we're suggesting that you use scopes for their intended purpose, this delegated consent or authorization scenario, and avoid the issues you get with scope explosion. And of course, if you use an externalized access service, you can streamline that API application development, keep your developers focused on that business functionality, and greatly improve the maintenance total cost of ownership model going forward if you keep those APIs and microservices streamlined. The next point here is all about running or managing your authorization service like a microservice. So think of a DevOps model for identity and access management. We think that's an important characteristic so that you're managing the identity infrastructure the same way that you're managing your applications today to get the most capability out of that DevOps approach. And of course, if you want to dig deeper into this topic with us one-on-one, based on a conversation around your own specific requirements, we're of course happy to set that up. So David, it looks like we have a few minutes here for some questions. You ready for that?
I'm always ready, Gerry.
Okay, well, let's take this one first. So when authorization is done as a microservice, as we were just talking about, does this limit the number of attribute finders or policy information point connections that you can make?
It doesn't necessarily limit the number of connectors, but it might change the way you fetch information. If you're a microservice, you might not want to go back to an enterprise LDAP or an enterprise database where you would have a lot of that information. Instead, you might want to rely on the information being passed up front to you as we call the authorization microservice. But that's more of a decision. There's no technical limitation to that. You could do either or. And it's also a matter of knowing where you integrate. So I think the challenge is more if you're protecting a microservice, then that microservice alone might contain the metadata you need to make the decision. Therefore, the microservice would want to pass that information to the authorization service. The fact that the authorization service itself is a microservice doesn't really have much of an impact on where we fetch the information from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and another way that I've heard this asked recently, David, was what if the attribute sources themselves are deployed in containers and you have multiple containers? How do you configure that? And so that's you would typically deploy that behind some kind of load balancer unit, right, where you have a static IP address to connect to.
And a couple days ago, one of my customers was telling me that they want the attribute connector or the PIP configuration to be more dynamic or configurable so that they can change the host endpoints real easily as the infrastructure changes. That's also something that can be done very easily through API configuration.
Mm-hmm. Okay, here's a clarifying question about the filtering on the payload coming back through the API gateway, David. Yeah. So the person here is asking who filters the data? Is it the API gateway that's filtering the data, or is it the PDP?
So it would be the API gateway doing the actual filtering, but the order to filter and what to filter and how to filter would be dictated by the policy within the policy decision point. Mm-hmm. So what would happen typically, there's a couple of different ways it can be done, but my favorite one is the following. So on the way in, can I view record 123? Yes, you can. Okay, good. I'm going to go fetch record 123 from the back end. All right, record 123 comes back through the gateway, and then the gateway would parse the record and understand that there's 4 parts to it, for instance. And then the question to the PDP would be, can the user view record ID, text ID, email, account balance of record 123? Send that off to the PDP, then the PDP would reply with a permit or a deny, and potentially, if it was a deny, meaning you're going to mask it, you could have an obligation or an advice that would contain masking rules. It could be that you don't want to mask entirely. You might want to just mask the 12 digits and then return the last 4 of the credit card number, or maybe you want to encrypt a value, or maybe you want to tokenize a value. So the masking, the redaction itself is done by the gateway. The order to mask, the order to redact, and how you redact is done by the policy.
And then there's a second part of this, if in this example we're dealing with a signed XML document, how do we handle that if we're redacting part of that?
Yeah, that's a good point. We'd have to go re-sign it. So you'd have to delegate. What I would typically do is I would delegate the signing of the XML document to the API gateway and let the API gateway do the signing. That's actually more in line with microservices architecture, where the microservice only returns the item. It doesn't do any additional processing of the item. And then the API gateway does the signing of that document. So you would do the signing after you've redacted the information.
Right.
Of course, if you redact a signed document, you're breaking the signature.
Right.
So then it would be invalid. That's a very good point.
Okay, and David, there's a question here about ensuring that access tokens are not stolen by another API, and some other questions related to that. I think that's out of scope, to use a term, for us.
It is.
Is that fair to say? With us not implementing the OIDC or OAuth specs ourselves, that's really out of bounds for our discussion.
That's so the 4 different flows that are allowed in OAuth and OpenID. One of them protects you from the tokens being stolen. One of them does not. The implicit flow that you typically use for single-page applications talking to an API, and there's no backend. And in that particular case, you're exposed to having your token stolen. But that's something you have to cater for within your application, and it is out of scope of what we do, fortunately.
Right. Okay, and here's another question. Do we support localizable policy messages? For reasons of deny, for example, can you localize the message depending on the client?
You could, absolutely. I think that's sort of icing on the cake, really. It's not something we would want to necessarily do, but you can absolutely have an obligation or an advice, return a message, and the message could have been translated or localized into whatever language you're interested in, and that could be done through a policy information point. But it's kind of, I almost want to call it feature creep. You might want to rely on the application to do localization, where the obligation of the advice would return a message key, and then the application would display the actual message based on that message key in the relevant language for the user.
Okay, very good. A couple more here, and if we run out of time, we'll certainly email you back directly with a response to your question here. So here's a good one too, David. Is the PDP elastically scalable, or will the PDP become a bottleneck? And I think we hinted on that a little bit in our commentary, but do you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, so that's one of the biggest fears our customers have. They're always afraid that because you've externalized authorization, it's not going to work anymore. The performance is going to be terrible. And Gerry, I like to say that we make performance or lack of performance visible, right? You've heard me say this before. So when you've externalized authorization, now you know how expensive your application is. You know how expensive your authorization is, which also means you can act on it. In externalized authorization, the PDP by design is built to be scalable, elastically scalable to reuse the individual's terms. You can scale a PDP either vertically or horizontally by either adding more PDPs or adding more CPU and RAM to your PDP to make it perform better. So yes, it can scale, absolutely.
Or if, of course, if you're deploying it in a container, you can just spin up more containers
Yep,
as need be.
correct.
Yeah, and you can do that, automatically, based on, current capacity, utilization, and so on.
Right.
All right, how about this one? Do we have integration with third-party access management providers for web access policies?
We
So
do.
absolutely, right? CA, single sign-on, ping access, and in the very near future, with another one as well. So we'll keep you apprised directly about that development. Let's see, David, where do we want to go next? Here's a question asking if we have more developer-oriented webinars going over these concepts. So what do you say to that, David? Sometimes you do more of a boot camp kind of webinar. Do you think you'll do, you and the guys will do one on this topic in the future?
Yeah, I think it would be interesting to dive deeper into the technical configuration between the gateway and the Axiomatics policy server. That's probably something we'd want to do jointly with the gateway vendor to be more detailed.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something that we'll explore. And if there's any particular gateway you'd want us to focus on, if you just tell us in the question section what particular brand, we can look at doing that together.
Mm-hmm. All right, very good. Well, we're right at the top of the hour again, David. I think we should close there. There are a few other questions that, as I mentioned, we'll respond to you directly with answers. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Thanks, David, for partnering up on yet another webinar for Axiomatics.
You bet.
And we'll look forward to seeing everyone at the next event or the next webinar in the very near future. Thanks again for attending and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.